the same theory, but now looking at what are termed as the modern legal positivist, of course, led by Hart, and what they conceive as law. So, would uh, look at that. I pray that I'll be able to see you through the class. I just got an episode of headache attack last yesterday, so I think I'm still there. But we'll see how far we could go nonetheless. So I hope I'll be able to take you through the end. So we start with Hart. So I just want to understand from your reading, what did you gather from Hart's conception of law? Of course, Hart writes a seminal work, The Concept of Law, from which he departs from the classical theorist who saw the law as the command, of course, coming from a sovereign. Okay, so that's what we looked at, the command theory of law on Thursday. But how does Hart depart from them? What's Hart's understanding of law differently from what the Bentham and Austin uh, derivation of law is? Yes, Chelsea, start with you.
All right, thank you very much, Doc. Good morning.
Morning.
So, according to Hart, to him, the law is something that is not like there isn't any necessary correlation between law and coercion or between law and morality. And according to him, the moment you begin classifying all laws as coercive orders or probably as moral commands, then you would have oversimplified the relation between law, coercion, and morality.
Okay.
And looking at, I believe you mentioned Bentham, just trying to sort of maybe juxtapose the two. I would say that to Bentham, on the other hand, he was a positivist rather who proposed the utilitarian theory. And to him, there was the whole issue of how he criticized natural rights and termed them as nonsensical. And to him, again, all rights are basically the creation of positive law. And then human actions are motivated by desire to enjoy pleasure or prevent pain. And I think also the issue of all laws command, prohibit, or permit some form of conduct. So just trying to bring the relation between Bentham's theory of law and that of Hart, I see that Bentham criticizes natural rights and terms them as nonsensical. And going back to Hart, who also has more or less the same meaning, because to him there's no correlation between law and morality or law and coercion. So that's what I would just say in regards to Hart, and then bringing in Bentham.
So what is his view? If law shouldn't have a coercive effect or shouldn't have some coercion with it, so what's law for Hart? It is law if law shouldn't be connected to coercion, which
Right.
is Austin thinks law should have. Law should have a sanction.
So to him, he actually states that law and morality are close, but they're not related.
Okay.
That's what he says. And
and not related.
They're very close. According to Hart, law and morality are very close, but they are not necessarily related.
Can they coexist?
Can they coexist? I believe they could, because if the two are close, then coexisting is possible, probably, but I could expound on that. But from my general knowledge of heart and the law, I believe they can coexist, but then there's not really a relation between the
Okay, great, great. Thank you. Thank you. We'll look at that. Marcia Rike, what did you get from? And then we have to get two men on board. Yeah, you are being challenged by the female gender. Yes, Mercy. What did you understand
Yeah, so
about? Mm-hmm.
yeah, thank you. Good morning.
Money.
So just to build on what Chelsea has said, Hart kind of thought that the earlier positivists who we have seen, particularly Austin,
Mm-hmm.
had oversimplified the understanding of the law, and to Hart, this idea that the law was a command of the sovereign kind of was less sophisticated than what our understanding of law should be. So to him, to say that law is a command of the sovereign only dealt with the external part of the law, the force of the law, where now if the sovereign says this and you do not do it, then there's a force that can come. So the penalty part. But to Hart, law also had an internal element to it. There's something internally within us that would make us respect the law in itself. And now, looking at it this way, Hart was of the view that law in itself, by itself, is a social phenomenon. Just it can be understood by that. And so, people's conception of the law would be an expression of also their morality. And there's a part in his book, the concept of law, where he talks about even some form of enforcement is not necessarily the police, but even socially, the way we are programmed to obey some things could be just within us on a social level. And so that he made it a little bit more sophisticated. And even on the issue of all law being penalties, he came in with this idea that not all laws are equal. Some laws are like the primary ones, then the secondary ones. So that the primary ones, they can give obligation and such, and then the secondary ones kind of help the primary ones function. And this made it a little bit more sophisticated, so that even if we can see a procedure, they're still laws, but they're meant to help now the primary laws function. And then another thing he brought in that I thought was really interesting was this idea that for something to be law, it's not necessarily that the people themselves have to take it to be law. It's more or less the people who enforce the law who have to take the law to be law. So that if these people are now the enforcement mechanism, if they accept the law as it is, then it becomes the law because then they get to enforce it. And it's not necessarily with the people themselves that have to accept the law as it is.
What is Heart Association of morality? How does it relate with morality?
So Hart did believe that some laws are moral in nature, and he didn't, unlike other positivists, he does not completely divorce morality from law. Some laws can be moral and some laws are influenced by morality, but they're still separate entities. To Hart, law can exist as a phenomenon by itself. So just because some laws are moral and just because some laws are informed by morality does not mean that law and morality are one and the same thing. He did not reject that some laws, even if you look at them, they are moral in nature, but to him still law is law and morality is morality.
Okay, good. Uh-huh. Uh, any men in the room that would want to contribute? Are you still thinking?
No, I would want to give it a try, Doc.
Okay, go ahead, Mlando.
Personally, I would simplify it in the very most basic way that HLA Hart's conception of law is that law is a social fact. or as Marcia Rike has described it, law is a social phenomenon.
Mhm.
And then he goes ahead to state that laws can be categorized into two, or laws consist of a coming together of the primary and secondary rules. These primary rules are basically those that deal with obligations, and then to try and mitigate the gaps that arise from primary rules. We have secondary rules, which include rules like rules of recognition. So Hart also goes ahead to say that um, in a legal system, there's also need for obedience, the issue of obedience. And I think this is where morality comes in, that it's not really necessary for sanctions. Some morality or some degree of condition exists in us that automatically directs us to obedience towards certain rules. However, morality is separate and law is also separate.
Okay. What did you understand about the rule of recognition that Hart says? What is it? Did you?
These rules of recognition, according to me, um, I would give an example like the rule whereby someone turning 18 years can be considered an adult.
Hmm.
I would use that as an example.
Okay. 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 Another gentleman to conclude this our opening discussion. None. Okay. Okay, but we are still within the two-thirds gender rule, so I think that's okay. Okay, so let's look at what modern legal positivism is about. And I say the main proponent here we have is Hart. Okay, so and we need to see that whether I think at the end of the discussion we need to find out is Hart a legal positivist strictly speaking, or maybe he somehow abstracts himself from this legal theory. So let's engage and let's see whether his understanding of the law uh, remains him a true positivist, or as some critics would later argue, that he somehow seems to want to cohabit with law with morality, and we will see whether that's true or not true. And then of course, as always, it's important that when we as we interrogate his conception of the law, we try to see how that mirrors in our legal system, Kenya, and abroad, and how that mirrors. So I think that's the most important part of jurisprudence. So again, as always, the main argument of legal positivists is to deconstruct natural law theory. That's their main agenda. Of course, they disagree with natural law theorists who just see that law is law if it imbues morality, if it imbues uh, natural law senses. I mean, being made by a supreme being, discoverable through reason and other things. Okay, so Hart, of course, conception of the law is begins or is articulated in his work, that the concept of law, which was published in 1861, and that's where and he comes in because he disagrees with the classical theorists of positive law. He particularly Austin. He disagrees with Austin. Of course, we said Bentham's work were later published after his demise, and that Austin is the one who echoed or developed further Bentham's version of law. So So Hart comes in and find that Austinian's understanding of law is inaccurate. Is inaccurate, that it doesn't give a holistic picture of what the law is. I think that simply put, uh, Hart thinks that Austen's theory of law is devoid of some realities within society, so it's inaccurate. And his understanding of the law comes in to fill the gaps, the inaccuracies that are created by Austinian theory. So he comes in as a strong critic of Austin. And the first criticism that Hart uh, labels against Austinian theory is that law is not always the command of the sovereign. That law is not only the command of the sovereign. That law is varied. You know, there are multiple laws. Of course, most people see the discussion talking about rules. So the word rules in a Hart's conception of the law is interchangeable with the word law. So just in case you read that and you saw that, so that to Hart, law is not limited to the commands of the sovereign. Laws are varied, laws are multiple. And given that, he conceives law to be of two types. Okay? He conceives law to be of two types. First, what you would say to be the command, okay? That what you'd say to be the command, which he terms as primary rules. And that there are other laws that are not necessarily containing commands, but they are laws that prescribe about how to modify the law, how to change the law. Laws that talk about how to apply the commands, how to apply the commands. And law also that talk about how to identify the law, like when the law of recognition, the rules of recognition will tell us to be able to tell whether this is a statute, whether this is a judicial decision, whether this is a constitutional provision. Like there are laws, there are laws that also do a different function other than giving a command. Okay, so to Hart, in every legal system, in every legal system, there are laws that direct citizens to certain actions or omissions. Okay, so there are laws in a legal system. That laws are twofold. One, there's one category of law that directs citizens to certain actions or omissions, and this is what we call the primary rules. But there are also laws, the second type of law in a society, in a legal system, that direct officials, direct superiors or power holders, people that we have conferred power onto. So we have another category of laws that tell officials, that tell superiors how to identify law, how to modify or apply the primary rules. And I think it was a good example to say some of the laws of procedures would also be coming from here, because they help us to apply the primary rules, which now these other laws had terms them as secondary rules. Okay, these are what he termed as secondary rules. Therefore, for Hart, the primary rules are those rules that impose duties on citizens. Like they contain they impose duties, and maybe not necessarily on citizens, but other people as well. They impose duties, and then we also have rules that confer powers. So the rules that impose duty, the duty or impose an obligation to do XYZ, an obligation to refrain from doing ABCD. That in a society, every legal system has rules. One category imposes duties or obligations, and the other one, the other type of rules, the second type of rule, confers powers both on officials and citizens relating to, so confer to certain actions that they can do. Like you have powers, you have rights to do ABCD. Okay, so we look at this. This is the discussion, or this discussion about Hart's conception of the law. Like this is the main idea where he disagrees that law is a mere assertion of commands by a sovereign, but that there are other types of laws. But I think the main argument that he brings is that, and we'll discuss this later. Where do we? You see, for Austin, a law is valid. A law is valid if it emanates from a sovereign. You know, of course, we saw what. So a law is valid if it's a command by a sovereign. So, and we saw what that command is, what it needs to have, the features that it must be written, and other things. And that's where the validity of the law comes from. So if a law doesn't come from a sovereign, then it's not law, according to Austin. And that Austin theory, that's not law. But for Hart, this is where we're going to see how to, even when he identifies laws as of two categories, then his validity of the law comes from, he also has his own assertion of what makes law valid, or what makes us obey the law. Okay, so we're going to look at that. Let's first look at the criticisms that he has against Austinian theory. First, he criticizes, the first criticism he has, or what makes him depart from the classical theories, is the idea that law is a command by the sovereign. Okay, and for Hart, law is not just mere commands by sovereign, that we have laws that impose duties, which you might think that's the category of a command. And laws also help facilitate the application of these commands. Laws that also enable the modification of the laws, the changing of the laws, and laws that also help us to identify the kinds of laws we have in the legal system. So that's the first criticism. And we let's look at the other criticism, then we come back to the centrality of Hart's conception of the law. Okay, so the second criticism that Hart has against Austinian theory is that Austin conceives law or equates law as a scientific as a scientific approach. You know, like that. Austin approaches law through a scientific approach. You know, a scientific approach which explains law in empirical terms, like because they're talking about, you know, if you look at the classical theories, they say law derives from facts, the way things are. That's why we say law is what it is. Law derives from facts and doesn't derive from the state of nature. That's what they argue. So Hart isn't happy with the way classical positivists approach law scientifically through empirical terms. You know, that for Hart, Austin sees law as an empirically observable tendency of some to obey the commands of others. You know, that Austin looks at law. When you say something is law, when empirically there is some observable tendency, you can see a tendency of some to obey the commands of others, and the ability of those others to impose sanctions for disobedience. Like uh, what Hart is saying is that laws, that Austen's conception of validity of law, that this is law, derives from the fact that you see people, these obedience to a law, when these obedience to a law, that because people obey the law, and that absent of obedience they get punished. And for Austen, that's the law, you know. But Hardy is against that, and he says sometimes people obey the law not because they want to, or not because they're even afraid, uh, you know, that people obey the law not because they understand it to be the law, but people obey the law because it's a habit. Like it's a habit that we have to do that, and maybe they obey the law because out of fear, but not because they have um, not because they embrace it as law. Um, I don't know whether that's a bit clear. So Hart faults Austen for deriving the validity of the law from the mere fact that people are obeying it, and that superiors have a right to punish people for disobedience. Okay, so that's Hart's argument, that it is wrong for classical theories to derive the validity of law. Validity of law is whether it contains a force of law, whether something contains a force of law, and that it merits obedience, or it merits to be named law. So Hart says Austen is wrong to assert the validity of law from the regularity of how people obey the law, and the ability of the superiors to impose sanctions for disobedience. To Hart, that's when that happens, we can't say that's law. But the fact that people obey some commands, people obey commands of others, and the ability of those others to impose sanction for disobedience, that to Hart is not law. You know, for Hart, and this is how he derives the validity of law, the what's law. To Hart, to argue about to show only that part of the law that is externally observable, just the fact that we are observing how people are obeying a certain law, and that there is ability of others to punish those others who disobey the law. That's not how we derive validity of the law. We Austinian theory misses a very basic point to Hart. If you just argue the validity of the law from the fact that you can observe people obeying the commands of the superior, and that if they disobey, the superior can punish them, that's not where we derive the validity of the law. Because that's just an external observation. You like the way you're seeing people obey a certain perspective of law, and you intimate that they are actually, that's the law. To Hart, the validity of the law derives from the fact that people intrinsic in them have accepted the command as the law. So that a law is law for Hart, a law is law if there is popular acceptance of the command. And popular acceptance means that law, that command represent, the command represents uh, the society's acceptable standard. For simply put, let me put it very simply, then we can get a bit philosophical. But just if you can, you take what Hart is saying in very simple terms. It says law is not necessarily a command of the superior, but law is law, or law derives its validity from the fact that it represents an acceptable societal standard, simply put. So that people obey the law, not because it's a command of the sovereign, but because it reflects their communal shared standard. Does that make sense? So that's the simply put conceptions or conception of Hart law. So while Austin would argue law is a command of the superior, Hart says it's not the superior that make the law. For him, it's not the superior that make the law. Even if they do, they're actually depicting the societal attitude towards a certain thing. That law reflects the standard of the society, at least by a majority, the majoritarian uh, attitude. So which we can simply say that's what the people in that particular society see or conceive that things must be done in a certain way, and that people must refrain from doing certain acts. So law is not necessarily a command by the sovereign, but law is a shared societal attitude towards something, or a shared societal standard. So it must be shared by the society. Then that's when it becomes law. So that's where you get the value of the law. So that's simply put in very, very simple words, in case the legal arguments escape you, the philosophy in his argument escape you. That is simply what he says. So what Hart says, that when Austin predicates or bases his identity of the law to that externally observable fact, he misses a basic part of legal practice. So what the external observable fact that Austin uh, uh, has, Austin is where Austin says that from scientifically, when you have you can see people, that the validity of the law comes from the fact that there's an observable tendency of some to obey the commands of others, and the ability of those others to impose sanctions for disobedience. So that's the external fact that you can see people are obeying this particular law, and that if there's disobedience, then there's ability to punish them. And Hart says, if Austin just bases the identity of the law to that externally observable fact, he misses a basic point in legal practice. That is, so which is this basic point that is missing in Austin's theory? The acceptance of those legal norms, by both officials and citizens as the basis for their action. That people obey the law because they embrace it, because they have accepted that that's how, in their society, that's how things should be. So say, but just to see that because people obey a certain law, and because people, if they don't obey, they can be punished, that is not enough to derive validity of the law. It must be that people obey the law because they share the values contained in that law. And I'm using the word values very deliberately, because they share the values that are contained in that particular law. Okay, so that Hart says this aspect of popular acceptance, the shared value, the shared embrace, the embrace of the law by a majority in the society. So this aspect of popular acceptance is what distinguishes a legal system from the mere imposition of force by gangsters or tyrants. Okay, I'll repeat that. Hart says this aspect of popular acceptance is what distinguishes a legal system from the mere imposition of force by gangsters or tyrants. So that Hart equates Austen's conception of law to almost dictatorial regimes, autocratic regimes, where people obey the law just by the mere fact they emanate from superiors. And Hart believes that people should obey the law because they accept it to be the law, not because it comes from the superior, but because they accept it to be the law. Okay? Otherwise, it says if we obey the law just because they come from the superiors, then there's no difference between tyrannical regimes and when like a robber, like instructs you to do things, and you're doing it because you're fearful of your life. Maybe he's armed. Of course, all robbers are armed. Because you're fearful that he might hurt you, and therefore you obey him. So you're obeying the law, or you're obeying his instructions out of fear. So you're out of fear. So what Hart wants is that to remove the obedience of law, or to disassociate obedience of law from fear, or the obedience of law because it comes from some power, some superior to ordinary citizen, but that law should be that which is accepted by both the superiors and the citizen. That this reflects our society. This reflects our context. That's the law. Okay. I hope you've got it up to that. So, therefore, now that you've understood, or maybe you've got the validity of the law, for Hart, the validity of the law comes from the fact that, yes, we may be following commands, but we follow commands because we have accepted it as a reflection of our conduct as a society, not because it comes from a superior. And therefore, Hart sees law as containing two features. For Hart, law has two features. One, it has an external aspect. I think that's what Marcia Riki was saying. The law has an external aspect, which is the performance of certain actions. What I've just said, obedience to the commands. So, like, law has two aspects. One, external, which is the performance of certain actions, or refraining from others. Omissions. Law always has actions and omissions. So, the performance of certain actions, and which is what we call obedience to the commands. The second feature of law is an internal aspect, an inherent aspect of the law, which is a critical reflective attitude, of the society. So it's an internal aspect shared by most members of the society towards the action, or towards the external aspect. An internal aspect, an inherent, like every law has an inherent feature within it, and which is what? Which is shared by most members of society. Like, so that's what we're talking about, the popular acceptance that every law has what we see yeah, the command stipulated. But the law also has an internal aspect, which is a critical reflective attitude. Critical reflective attitude in the sense that it represents the shared uh, standard of that particular society. So it has an internal aspect which is shared by most members of the society, that is towards the actions, towards the command. The people in that particular society accept the command because it reflects a standard that they identify with. So this is what we call the popular acceptance. So Hart says the internal aspect is manifested. How are you able to tell the internal aspect of law? He says it is manifested by members of society's ability to criticize those who deviate or threaten to deviate from the standard behavior. Okay, that the internal aspect of the law is manifested by members of the society, the ability of members of society to criticize those who deviate, those who disobey the command, uh, ability to criticize those who deviate or threaten to deviate from the standard behavior by demanding conformity and by acknowledging the actions as indeed proper. Okay? What Hart is simply saying here is that the law has two parts: the external part, which is the performance of certain actions. This is what the law is calling you to do. The law calls you to do something. And that's what you talk about, the obedience to the commands. And second, law also contains, so he agrees that law contains sanctions, but the sanctions derive from a communal shared standard, a communal shared standard. So that the sanction does not come from superior, but it's because as a society we say that, like maybe in criminal law, for example, where you see, of course, I'm trying to paraphrase, in the penal code, where maybe they're saying theft by servant, that if you're a worker and you steal from your employer, that's we term theft by servant. So, like, I think there's the prescription or the provision would not be as what I'm saying, but ideally it might be saying you cannot steal from your employer. The law may not be couched in the same words the way I'm putting it. You cannot steal from your employer, maybe, for example. But if you do, of course, theft by servants is 8 years imprisonment. Yeah, so that the sanction, so this law contains sanctions, but for Hart, this 8 years imprisonment is not because it's coming from superiors, but it's because as a society we have accepted that should be the standard. It's a shared standard that if you steal from your employer, it's so obnoxious that you have to serve, if you found guilty, 8 years imprisonment. Okay, so he says that the internal aspect is manifested by the ability of members of society to criticize those who deviate. So how do you criticize? By demanding conformity. So, of course, conformity is not to steal from your employer, and by acknowledging the actions as indeed proper. That if it's a law that has a positive proposition, then we are acknowledging, as a society, we acknowledge that that's the right thing. Okay, uh, and that language always exhibits the manifestation of this criticism. That these laws are written. When it says language exhibits the manifestation of this criticism, is that even this uh, internal aspect is written. Okay, the internal aspect of justice, so that are the sanctions are actually written. So of course that's like the example of theft by someone is that it's there. Anyone found guilty of this offense shall be liable for 8 years imprisonment, jail term. So heart for heart, the internal aspect of the law represent the appropriate shared standard of behavior uh, in a society. The internal aspect represents the appropriate shared standard in a society. So I hope you get it, and maybe I can stop there at least to discuss about the validity, just in case to just gauge whether you've understood the validity of the law. But just to conclude that Hart says law is just not a command by the sovereign, but an acceptable standard of behavior in a given society. You know, and law, Hart thinks if you limit law to just a command by a sovereign, this is to equate obedience. I mean, it's an inability to distinguish obedience from habitual acts. It's an ability to be able to distinguish obedience from fear. That law should not be something, as somebody say, just brings coercion. Law is not just coercive acts. It's more than that. So Hart concludes that laws are social rules. They're social rules. They create actions and institutions which can be understood only by interpreting the meaning they have for those engaged in them. You know, um, so law to heart, laws are social rules. They create actions. So of course, laws create actions. These are some you can do this, you can do this, but they also create institutions. The courts, the executive, parliament, the commissions. You know, you know. So laws create actions and institutions which can be understood only by interpreting the meaning they have for those engaged in them. That law is contextual. That's what Hart is saying. They represent the society in which they are made. And therefore, you may have seen in some texts where they see a Hart's conception of law is hermeneutic. Hermeneutic in the sense that it's reflective, it's contextual. Law is contextual. That's what Hart is saying. That the inherent aspect of the law is a reflection of the society. That this is a shared attribute of society, and that law is a societal responsibility. It's not only a reserve of the command. Okay, you may have seen some places where they say Hart's conception of law is hermeneutic, in that law is contextual. And from this, I understand what Hart is also saying, that what is a particular standard. A particular standard in a given society may differ from another, and that's why what is law in Kenya or what is lawful in Kenya may be unlawful in another territory. What is lawful in another territory may be unlawful in Kenya. So I think that's basically what she's saying. But let me stop there and just get to see. So we've talked about two criticisms that Hart labels against the classical positive theorist. First, he disagrees with the categorization of law as a command by the sovereign only. So he disagrees with that. And of course, he says that laws are of two types. We have the primary rules, which create the commands, and we have secondary rules, which apply or facilitate the observation of the commands. And we haven't looked at that in depth. The second criticism he labels is about how do we say something is law? I mean, when do we say we have just laws and therefore we should obey them? The validity, the question of the validity of the law. And for Hart, he also uh, deconstructs Augustinian conception of the validity of the law and say it's not enough to say something carries the force of law by the mere observation that it is obeyed and that there's ability to punish its disobedience. That you cannot say something carries within it intrinsic force of law by the mere fact that it creates, it commands for obedience, and it also has ability to punish for disobedience. Okay, and for Hart, yes, law has commands, but the obedience of the law derives from the fact that the society within which that law applies accepts that command as its standard, as its shared standard. Okay, let me pause there and get to hear what you have to say, and then we can look at we can come back to the categorization of law into two by hand. So let me hear your reaction. You have understood, uh, especially his idea on the conception, on the validity of the law. Uh, yeah, let me stop there. Yes, Chelsea.
Yes, Doc. I was just trying to wrap my head around everything because in reality it is a mouthful. But from the second critique of Austin's theory of law in relation to the question of the validity of the law, I don't know if it's just me, but I'm seeing as if Hart is a legal positivist with natural law tendencies in a way,
Mm-hmm.
because he keeps on strongly disagreeing with Austin's derivation of the validity of the law, which is that people are obeying the law and that superiors have a right to punish people for disobedience. And according to Hart, that in itself is not law. And the moment you kept on reiterating that, then my head just kept on going to the fact that Hart could actually be a legal positivist with natural, low tendencies. But then again, it also brings me to the whole issue of, can human beings really just obey the law for the sake of just obeying it? Or they are only able to obey a law when they are sure that in the case when they do not obey a law, then there will be sanctions for the same. And that only brings me to the fact that unless you are a person of integrity or a person who is morally upright in this context, then unless there's something that will happen to you if you don't obey the law, then I don't necessarily see humans going that particular way. But then in a way, I also agree with what Hart was saying, because why would you punish someone for obeying a law that maybe they didn't create? That's just, the thing that's running through my mind, and how he also divides the law into two aspects, the external aspect and then the internal aspect as well. I think that is like a deeper way of him actually, categorizing the law. Like the law has an internal aspect, an external aspect. So he's actually taking us to a different realm, if that's the right way to put it,
Mm-hmm.
because many times we only look at the external aspect and we look at, the performance of actions. What is the law calling us to do? And sometimes, in a way, we fail to actually analyze the internal aspect, which is now the reflective attitude of the society, which is, what represents the appropriate standard of behavior in a society. So, in a way, I do agree with Hart that, law is not a command of the sovereign, but it is an acceptable standard of behavior. And this is where I see his natural tendencies coming
Okay.
from.
Yeah, and I guess you're right, because and that's we'll see what the critics of Hart say. They think that he has a soft spot for natural law, for morality. Of course, we see, and these critics actually equate these acceptable shared standard as morality. Like that's what societal morality is about. So that's what they say. You might have seen somewhere where people describe it as Hart's conception of law as soft positivism. Like it's yes, he insists that law is a command, but then he says that command is even if it's made by the superior, it's a shared attitude by the general populace, which includes the superior. That they believe that this is what should reflect our societal behavior. And I think the question would be, is that so? I mean, is so? Do you agree with the critics that Hart's conception is actually soft positivism? He doesn't totally disassociate himself with natural law, and that is that true or not true? I don't know. Uh, and the second question to that will be, what do you think yourself? Who is right? Of course, there's not the right of something cast on stone that this is a right. But whose idea do you agree with more? You know, critical, absolute uh, disassociation of law from natural tendencies, or some accommodation of natural tendencies. So that's up to you. I mean, who persuades you most? I think that will be the question. Yes, Marcia Rike. Mercy?
Thank you. Um, so to begin with answering the last question, because that would be easiest for me as I've already put my position in class. I don't agree that anyone can be strictly on one side. You can't just be purely naturalist or purely positivist. They don't even see how that could work. You have to find a way to marry the two so that then it becomes practical.
Okay. Yeah, and any other thing you want to say, Mercy? Yeah, and that's your view, Mercy. That's your view, that you think you can't totally separate the
Derives
two things.
from the shared standard of the members of society and how they view the
Mercy,
law and what
Mercy,
it
Mercy,
should be.
Mercy.
I think sometimes it's true, but sometimes it's really not. To give an idea of feminism, especially let's say feminism in Africa, it wasn't really this women's rights and equal opportunities and all that. It wasn't the shared standard of society before. It's something that people kind of worked on, and sometimes the law actually had to lead the people. It wasn't that the people, this was the standard. The law just said this will be the standard, and if you, yeah, if you deviate, then we will punish you. Let's say this idea of my dress, my choice. I think if we go back, we will remember like just a few years ago because it will still be fresh in memory. Yes.
No, no, we lost you at some point, Mercy, and I don't know whether it's my machine that is very slow, or you. Where we had lost you at some point.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I hope I'm audible now.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was talking about this external aspect of the law and where I deviate from Hart's point of view, because to me, I think sometimes the law itself gives the society what ought to be the standard. And I was thinking in terms of feminism, and particularly in our jurisdiction, for something that will be fresh in memory for all of us, this idea that women should be allowed to dress how they want to dress, regardless of what society thinks. Uh, Before, it was the standard that you have to dress in some way, and if you dressed in a different way to how society didn't particularly want, was not the standard, women would even get their clothes stripped off in the streets. And it was every other day in the news, this woman got stripped, this woman got stripped. It was every other day until the point where it had to come that you really cannot do that, and if you do that, you're going to suffer penalties. So the standard of society was different, and society was trying to impose that standard, but the law came and said, no, this is actually the standard and this is what we are supposed to do. And we can see that changing as time goes by. People, regardless of what society thinks, people are allowing other people, women particularly, to dress how they want. So I think in some ways it's true that the external aspect of society does give validity to the law, but sometimes the law itself can be coercive, and the coercive power can give the standard by which the law expects the society to act. And then on this idea that Hart is a soft positivist because of how this aspect of the, not the external, sorry, I keep saying external, internal, because of this aspect of internal this idea of the internal aspect of the law. I don't think necessarily it makes him a naturalist, because sometimes the internal aspect of society can be viewed as something immoral, but that does not change the fact that Hart still says that this makes the law valid. We can take the idea of Germany during the Nazi period. A majority of society was in acceptance with those laws, but it has come out and people have generally agreed that that was not moral. But to Hart, that still would have been the internal aspect that is manifested by members of society, that the Jews are subhuman, they are substandard, they ought to just suffer how they suffer, and the laws that are there, they are okay. But that is not particularly moral. Even if we go to just the issue of slavery, at the time, a majority of white people would have thought that there's nothing wrong with this. The internal aspect that was manifested by members of society was not particularly moral, but still does not mean that Hart's validity of the law goes away. So I don't think it makes him a naturalist. I just think his idea of what law is different. It has two aspects, but it does not mean that this internal aspect necessarily has to be a moral aspect in the way natural law understands what morality is.
Okay, and you bring an interesting point about the about slavery, about the annihilation of the Jews, and maybe one would add, may want to add in that debate the death penalty. You know, and what Hart is saying, so that the internal aspect reflects societal shared attitude, and some people have seen that aspect of shared standard as bringing societal morals into law, and that's why they're saying he's a soft positivist. But what I want to bring in is what is moral here may be immoral somewhere else, and maybe uh, during the Nazi regime, it was moral to kill the Jews, to destroy them. It was moral. It was also moral uh, to have slaves, just as it was moral uh, to have death penalties for certain offenses. So I don't know. I'm not necessarily. I'm trying you to think more. Not that I disagree with you. I think Here we all have to defend our positions. But the thing is, could they be right, those who say that he is bringing morality into law, when that's exactly what the classical theories are trying to avoid? In the sense that, well, you see slavery as immoral. Now, what was there? How was it for that society that practiced it? Remember what Hart is saying is that law is contextual. The law reflects, sorry, the societal attitudes, the attitudes of every given society. So you may want to think about that, and you may want to go deep and assess those people who practice slavery, uh, those people who targeted the Jews. What value did they associate with slavery, or what value did they associate with the destruction of the Jews? As an outsider, you and I can say that was immoral. Was it for them? Just trying to complicate things further. Michael Barrow.
Thank you. For me, I think Hart confirms that we cannot divorce morality from the internal aspect that he argues in his assertion. To me, that internal aspect, that critically reflective attitude, what's the source of that process? And for me, the source of internal aspect of law is basically natural law. So he may not be coming strongly to say that we cannot divorce morality or natural law from the law itself, but his argument on the internal aspect refers to what is the source of that internal aspect of the law, which goes back to morality. And in the aspect of, for example, what we refer to as slavery as not morality, I think morality is subjective to certain localities. It's subjective to certain geographical jurisdiction, such that currently we are saying that in Kenya, LGBTQ is immoral, and this is our our geographical jurisdiction. This is what we define morality as in our locality, in our situations, based on how, as the environment, as a community in Kenya, we've been subjected to. But you also go to other countries, and they have accepted LGBTQ as a morality to them based on their own principles. So to that locality, it's morality. So to our locality is immoral. So, but that internal aspect for me from heart, its source is natural. It's part of that morality, and therefore for him we cannot divorce natural law of morality. That's what I say.
Okay, good. And maybe again, to complicate things. Okay, it's true that Hart says law is contextual. They have a hermeneutic approach. Now you bring an interesting point, and maybe Marcia Rick is right that even when Hart calls for the reflection of societal values into the law, the people obey the law because it represents them. You know, it represents their thoughts, it represents their attitudes, That's why people obey the law. And maybe, as Marcy says, that is not necessarily natural law, or that's not necessarily morality, because again, if we understood natural law, would natural law endorse same-sex relations the way you're saying? In other contexts, the values of other jurisdictions, their societal values, their shared societal values, perhaps, is that same-sex relations are okay, and that would be reflected in their laws. I gave you an example that at the moment France is engaged in a national debate whether or not to recognize same-sex marriages. Okay, out of those debates, there will be a vote, and if the majority vote agrees, then that will be the law. That will be the law, as we have seen in other jurisdictions, that they would vote, and if it's acceptable by a majority, then that becomes the law. The question is, when this has become the law, then is that really true a natural tendency? Because I want to believe the naturalists would argue that same-sex relations conflict the natural order, mainly. So we must look for a proper category to put Hart. He's calling he's deriving of validity of the law from the fact that people obey the law because it represents them. I think that's simply put, that people be obey the law because it represents them. Does that make him have a soft spot for natural law? And is the shared societal attitude always towards natural tendencies? I mean, that's a question you want to reflect. I'm not trying to confuse anyone, but I just want us to be broader in our perspective. Sometimes maybe the shared attitude actually conflicts natural tendencies. Okay, and Mercy, I want to say you brought a very interesting point when you say sometimes the superior uh, impose a value on the people. I think that's a good one. That's a good one. As to whether we have a law that relates to dressing, I'm not sure about it. Maybe you want to look at that. Is that the same as the right to privacy, or is it the same that the right to privacy? I think that's what Article 31 or thereabout. I'm not sure. Or does that fall under the right to equality, where you cannot be discriminated against on the basis of your dress? I don't know. Okay, let's hear last from Ibrahim, and then we can take a break.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
thank you. I think one thing that really stood out for me is when Hart says law is accepted by both superior and the subjects, which is not true with Austinian theory. And I think that really is the reality in the current world, the modern way, that nobody is above the law. I think this is very, very much valid. The other part, we say that Austinians approach law from a scientific angle. And that, what about the conception of law by Elehat? I think also, since he's talking about majority, and now, for example, if someone does probably a research, then the will of the majority also scientifically the same will come to the same level, because if the majority are now for it, and someone even does it from even the research and it comes as scientific research, then the views ultimately will be scientific, and I think they will end up with the same. They will be the same results, I think. So I would also say his observation can also be empirically observable because it is reflecting the will of the majority. I don't know that's. But again, my other issue is, like in Kenya, we see laws that are passed by parliament, sometimes by force kind of things like security laws and all this. some of those laws we see they do not reflect the will of the majority. So again, I will imagine this becomes problematic. That some of the laws we are passing is not the reflection of the majority, but probably reflection of the political class and how they want this thing to be driven. So that is my thinking, Dr. So.
Oh, okay, yeah, and maybe the last bit where you're saying that some laws are a pure reflection of the political class and not necessarily the majority. And have in mind the ongoing debate without preempting what's going to happen. The president has said he's going to uh, increase taxes, simply put, and that has to be done anyway for Kenya to survive. And what is the majority view of the Kenyans? That no way, you cannot do that. But he says he's gonna do it, whether we like it or not. Do that. Uh, have NSF deductions increased, and I bring this, and I hope you read Article 210 of Article 1, which says no taxes can be imposed unless through legislation. So the president will need to have the Financial Act amended to increase the taxes. It's going to be low because it must be passed by Parliament. Most likely it will pass, given the recent events we've seen in Parliament, that there's a deliberate decision to pass any government proposal. So it might pass. But that may not necessarily augur well with the majority. Or maybe it does. Maybe the bigger part of the Kenyan society belongs to the hustler nation, or the hustler. Maybe they're okay. They're okay if people in formal employment continue to be taxed. Maybe it is. I don't know. But that's kind of an argument that we have. Okay, so I suggest we take a brief break, just for me also to just kind of relax a bit. And then when we resume, we will look at the two typologies of law that had postulates, and then and see how that reflects in the cases. And then we bring in some practical examples. If we have time, we'll go to the Kelsenian theory. If we don't, I will postpone that to next week's class. But I think the idea, you get the point that in jurisprudence, it's how you are seized with information. You need to be able to have some information about a particular theory and be able to support it. That's what is different. There may not necessarily be right and wrong answers, provided you bring a very, very plausible argument to back your stand viewpoint. So let's take a break. It's 10:38. Let's resume at 10:48. I'm a bit late. I was trying to follow some rules just to entice our discussion. So let's proceed, and let's see how we will get there. We'll finish this. Okay, so we want to continue now with Hart's first criticism against the classical theories that law is not just a command of the sovereign, that law is divided into two types, So we have what we'll call laws that contain commands and laws that not necessarily contain commands, in the sense that a command, we are saying a command, other than if you look at the classical theories, what a command was, is that it would be the wish of the superior, and of course, followed by a sanction, by a penalty, followed by a penalty. And this is what Hart is actually against, that not all laws contain penalties, not all laws contain sanctions, some don't. Okay, so let's look at the first typology of laws as seen by Hart, and we need, as I've always say, to think or to reflect whether whatever he says really applies in any legal system, whether in the past or present. So that's what the essence of jurisprudence is, to question whatever legal theory you're learning or you're coming across, whether what it says is practical. Okay, so Hart says that a legal system contains two types of rules. Okay, two types of laws. The first one are rules that impose obligations or duties. This is what he calls the primary rules. Rules that impose obligations or duties, and he terms them the primary rules. So in the primary rules, the general command for conformity is insistent. That these in the primary rules, there's always the what he says that the general rules always contain the internal aspect of the law. That the general rules contain the shared societal standard. So he says in the primary rules, the general command for conformity is insistent, and the social pressure for those who deviate is great. You know, that the laws that impose obligation, you know, the laws that require people to do certain things or to refrain from doing other things, you know, always have the internal aspect, you know. So he says the general command for conformity is insistent, and the social pressure for those who deviate is great. But even then, he says the primary rules, which sometimes are called obligation rules or necessary rules, he also called them necessary rules. Again, the primary rules, he says, are also of two types. So the primary rules are also of two types. Much as the general definition of primary rules is that they impose obligations. They impose obligation, and there's also an element within them of conformity, that there's need to conform, and also there's social pressure in case of disobedience. But he says there are of two types. There are those that contains physical sanctions, and this he calls them the coercive type. These are the ones that have coercion. They contain physical sanctions. Okay? And there are those that do not. So even in the rules that impose obligations, some contain physical sanctions and some do not. And those that do not contain physical sanctions, he says they represent the morality of the society. So they may not necessarily be carrying sanctions, but because there's insistence to conform, and there's insistence to conform, and there's sort of reprisals for not conforming, there's social pressure not to deviate, then even absent of physical sanctions, they represent the morality of the society. And I think basically that's what we've agreed. Of course, where morality comes from is a different question altogether. That is, does morality come from natural law or something else? That's a different argument altogether. So, Hart argues, for societies to survive, there must be these obligations, primary rules, or we must have rules that impose obligation or duties. Hart says for society to survive, there must be these obligations, what he terms as necessary rules, because of man's nature, which is partly selfish and partly a cooperative creature. Okay, so just hear what he argues, and we can continue categorizing Hart where he belongs. He says, for society to survive, there must be these obligation rules or the necessary rules because of man's nature, which is partly selfish and partly cooperative. These necessary rules, Hart calls them as the minimum content of natural law. Okay, these necessary rules, Hart describes them as the minimum content of natural law. Okay, he says it is thus important in a society to have rules, for example, those which restrict violence, theft, or deception. It is necessary to have rules in society that restrict violence, theft, and deception. And he continues to say that sometimes, however, the obligation rules may conflict with an individual's interest. Maybe you have a propensity to steal, and then the law says, society says stealing is bad. Maybe you have propensity to engage in sexual actions with minors. Society says that's bad too. Maybe you have, as you said, you are inclined to have sexual relations with people of the same sex, and society says that's bad. Anyway, so it says, or maybe, and many other examples that you could think of, but it says the obligation rules sometimes conflict with an individual interest. So I hope you understand the first category, that rules, that every legal system has two types of rules. The first one, rules that impose obligations or duty. And he says here the general command for conformity is insistence, and this is a pressure for those who deem it is good is great. And that's what I've said, that the primary rules have the internal aspect of law within them. And he also subdivides the primary rules into two, those that contain physical sanctions and those that do not. And that those that do not have sanctions, Hart finds them as a representation of the morality of the society. And Hart's believe that for any society to survive, it must have the obligation rules, or what he also termed as the necessary rules. That for every society to survive, it must have the obligation rules. Why? Because of man's very nature. That man is partly selfish and partly cooperative. And if I think what is trying to allude to, if man were to be allowed to live the way he wants to live, I think that's what Chelsea Wynne was saying. A man can be destructive. You know, he can destroy the rights of others. You know, if man were to be allowed to live the way he wants, he can destroy others. And therefore, he says we need to have these obligation rules. I don't know whether, and I'm being very cynical here, whether what is happening, the war in Ukraine, whether that depicts man's nature. It's partly selfish and partly creative, cooperative, you know, that if man were to be left to be the way he is, maybe And I'm being very, very cynical. Not that I belong to any part of the war, but let's look at what Putin is doing. No, he's attacked Ukraine. Other countries neighboring Ukraine are also fearful, and they now want to join NATO just to protect themselves. I think Poland the other day, Poland, Finland, took polls and they are joining the NATO because they're saying after Ukraine will be next. So if and of course we wonder whether public international law is law, or if it were law, and if we didn't have the Charter of the UN that discourages a country from invading another, maybe Putin would just take any other country that was hitherto a Soviet Union or part of the Soviet Union. We do have the UN Charter, but how come Putin was able to invade Ukraine? Or is it because of the UN Charter? Then the community of nations find a majority of it, because not everyone finds that Putin's attack of Ukraine is against the law. Just think about it. Okay, so what Hart argues is that as a society, we may need to have the obligation rules, and this is necessitated by the nature of man, who is sometimes selfish and sometimes a cooperative creature. And these necessary rules Hart describes as the minimum content of natural law, as if he's alluding to the fact that law must have a minimum content of natural law. Whether you agree with that or not, we will see. Okay, so the second category, and of course he also says that sometimes the obligation rules may conflict with an individual interest. You know, these rules that impose obligations on us, sometimes they command of us things that we do not believe to be the law. But they do that because maybe, as Muhammad says, the majority has had its way. Okay, the second category of rules that Hart says are in a legal system is the rules of change, adjudication, and recognition, the secondary rules. So the rules of change, adjudication, recognition, what he also describes as the secondary rules. And he says these are the power conferring rules. So the first type of rules regulate behavior in society. They basically regulate behavior in society. And the second, he terms them as the power conferring rules. They confer powers on officials and citizens. But individuals have rights, the rights to enter into a contract, the right to write a will individually. So they confer powers. Hart believes that the secondary rules are important in order to enable a legal system to cope satisfactorily with the need to change rules from time to time. The secondary rules are important because society is not static. Sometimes there's need to change the rules, to amend the rules, to repeal the rules, to enhance the rules. You know, I think it must be you that we're learning about what is amendment, what is amendment of the law. So amendment means many things. It means changing, but how do you change? You can change by subtracting, you can change by adding. I think you can also change maybe by removing. So he says secondary rules are necessary to enable a legal system first to change, to cope with the need to change rules from time to time, that the society sometimes may be called upon to change its rules. So you need the secondary rules. But secondary rules are also important to help a legal system to cope satisfactorily with the need to decide on disputed questions. Sometimes cases are brought before court. How does the court go about that particular case? The procedural rules. It's quite important. We may have substantive rules, but the court needs to be directed on how to apply the substantive rules, how to go about, adjudicating a particular case before it. So that secondary rules are important to help a legal system cope with the need to decide on disputed questions. And thirdly, the secondary rules are also pivotal to enable a legal system with the need to distinguish obligation rules from other rules, with the need to identify the applicable laws in that society. This is what's called the rules of recognition, to identify laws, to naming the laws. So Hart concludes that secondary rules enable but do not require people and institutions to do certain actions. They help. They enable people and institutions to do certain actions, but they do not require them to do those things. I don't know whether that's true or not true, but so what Hart is saying, if you look at the rules of recognition, what Hart is saying, rules form part of a legal system, that laws form part of the legal system, but only those that meet the criteria laid down by the rule of recognition. Like, I think basically what he's saying in elaborating the rule of recognition is that a society may have many laws, but the applicable laws are those laws that have been identified by the law. Also, like which laws are applicable in Kenya. That's when you maybe have been invoking Article 2 of the Constitution in Section 3.1, for the entire Section 3 of the Judicature Act, that rules form part of a legal system, but only if they meet the criteria laid down by the rule of recognition. So that the rule of recognition is the one that tells us which laws are applicable in a particular society. So what Hart is saying is that, in a nutshell, what he's saying is that not all laws impose obligations. Some laws are there necessary to help in the change of laws, are there to help in the functioning of the courts, and some are there to identify the applicable laws in a country, to identify which laws are substantive and which are procedural, which laws do we say municipal, which ones are international, like the identity of laws. Some laws are there to help us with identifying the law. Okay, so that's Hart's argument. So That's Hart's conception of the law, that the validity of the law emanates from societal acceptance of the content of the law, that because the content of the law reflects the society's shared value. That's where we derive validity of the law. We do not derive the validity of the law from some command of a sovereign or because of it contains sanctions. And second, that law is of two types: those that which impose obligations and those which assist in the implementation or in the realization of the obligation. Those are the secondary rules. So that's basically Hart's conception of the law. So anyway, Hart's argument or conception of the law brought about critics. And they say that the critics largely argue that Hart's conception of the law is incompatible with legal positivism. That he's not a legal positivist strictly sensu, so they say he's departing from the classical theorists who just believe that law is a command by the sovereign. So critics argue that Hart's conception is incompatible with legal positivism. And this is what they argue, the critics. They say is Hart's conception of the internal aspect of the law. Hart's assertion of the internal aspect of the law connotes an inherent normativity of the law. That we obey the law because it represents a generally acceptable societal standard. What they're arguing, what the critics are saying is that it is as if Hart is saying that the law by itself has an inherent duty to obey it. That the enactment of the law, that the enactment of the law bears with it an inherent duty to obey it. Remember on Thursday, we were discussing that, and I shared with you this, that the creation of a court confers on that court an inherent jurisdiction to do justice, or an inherent obligation to do justice. Okay, and that's true. That's a legal argument that cannot be disputed. Maybe it can, but that's a very, very strong legal argument that the creation of a code in itself imbues with that code the inherent power to do justice, so that absent of the law, the court must do justice nonetheless. It must find a way to do justice nonetheless. So now critics are saying Hart's description of the law as having an internal aspect is the same as saying that the law itself has an inherent duty to be obeyed because it reflects a societal shared standard. Yet they say the original positivist was that people obey the law because it comes from a sovereign and because it carries with it a sanction. Hope you get it. Pretty says the original positivists saw obedience of the law, derived obedience of the law by the fact that the law was created by a sovereign, and because it carried with it some sanctions, some penalties. That's what the original argument of legal positive. But Hart is bringing a fact that inherently, because the law represents or reflects a shared standard of the society, then by that mere fact, then the law calls for obedience. That we have a legal duty to obey the law because it carries within it shared societal attitude. You know, so critics say, arguing that law has an inherent normative value, arguing that law has an inherent normative value is seeing the law as morally binding. Is just saying that people are, when you see the law, when you read the law, it's as if just by reading it, you have this sense that because it is the law, then it morally binds me. That when Hart argues that law has inherent normativity, is equating that law just by nature is morally binding, as if there's a legal duty to obey the law. Because the law states this, then Hart is making people feel that they have a legal duty to obey the law because it is the law. And so that's one point they're saying, is that when Hart argues that a law is inherently normative, he's actually saying that we have a moral duty to obey the law. As if there's a legal duty to obey the law. And when one argues that there's a legal duty to obey something, to say is the same as saying that that thing ought to be done. Okay, I will say that again. That Hart's conception of the law equates as seeing the law as morally binding, as if there's a legal duty to obey the law. And when one argues that there's a legal duty to do something, it is the same as saying that that thing ought to be done. Yet, for the classical theorist, law was not inherently normative. Legal duty ensued when the law was commanded by a sovereign or there was liability to a sanction. You know, classical theories, for classical theorists, it was enough that the law was a command. It was enough that the law was a command by a sovereign. Of course, the command we say contains the wish of the sovereign. It has a penalty, and it is written. That was enough for classical theories. And a command with a penalty and written, which would somewhat fill in just so that was enough for that was enough to call for obedience. So law by itself, so that's why you remember when the classical theorists were saying, when they talked about rules made by for a limited audience is not necessarily positive law, it's not necessarily law, and they also called for law with an expansive audience and such things. So law only was law if it came from a sovereign, a political superior. But critics now say that Hart seems to say that is not enough. It is not enough that law emanates from a sovereign. It also must have been accepted by society. Both the superiors and the citizens accepted that this is our shared value. Okay. So what critics are saying is that Hart's conception of the law concedes that positive law and morals share the same concepts. That after all, positive law and morality can share the same bed. You know, what is legal, what is contained in written law, must also be moral. That's what the critics are saying, is that what Katz is making us understand to be the law is to tell us that eventually that positive law and morals can coexist, that they share the same concepts, such that what is legal, what is contained in written law, must also be moral. I don't know what you think. I don't know which side of the aisle do you belong to. Do you agree with Hart's conception of the law? Do you agree with the critics? What do you think? And I'm assuming that you have understood what the critics are saying. Okay, we had earlier, I think Marcia Rick had earlier inferred the discussion about the destruction of the Jews, the Jews massacre, the practice of slavery. I also mentioned about the death penalty and the current argument against the death penalty, even in Kenya. Of course, you know, Rob, we haven't carried out death penalty in Kenya for quite a while. But for the offenses of robbery with violence, treason, and murder, the penalty is death penalty. Of course, we are told as fast it shouldn't be the only penalty in terms of murder, that the magistrate should have the judge should have a discretion on what penalty to give you. But what is the argument against death penalty? You know, I don't know whether you participated in those discussions, or you should we read the case of Muruatetu. But what argument comes out? You know, I when I was doing my pupillage myself some time back, you know, my pupil master is the one who argued the case of Muruatetu at the Supreme Court. Timothy Bryant, that was my pupil master. And I remember I was being exposed to this literature on death penalty. He was so much against death penalty. And I would read a lot of cases relating to death penalty in Kenya, abroad, you know, just so much exposition. And most of the argument that I would see there is that in the human rights document, they say it is immoral. I don't know whether they use the word immoral, what the meaning of morality attached to natural law. I would leave for you that to decide, but they would argue it's immoral for the state to kill a citizen because that citizen has killed another or has committed an offense that that state regards as so obnoxious that it only merits death. And the final question I have is that, can a judge, looking at Hart's conception of law, you know, that the law must have a shared, law should reflect a shared standard of the society. The question is, can a judge refuse to apply a law that he disregards or he regards as immoral? You know, how does that happen? I mean, can a judge, you're a judge here and you're deciding a case, can that judge refuse to apply the law if he feels the law brings an immoral consequence? The law may not be immoral, but it may result in an immoral consequence. Like in the case of maybe you're a judge who's against this penalty, but now this law calls you for passing death penalty. Can you just say that I am not applying this law because it will result in an immoral conclusion? Or are judges' hands tied after all, as far as legal positivism is concerned? Okay, I've thrown in 3 questions there. Let me hear what you have to say, and then I will conclude. So, Mercy, Chelsea, we start with you.
Thank you, Doc. I'll begin by answering your initial question in regards to the criticism of Hart's conception of the law. And I believe my argument comes back again that Hart is a legal positivist, that we have all agreed on. And I believe his natural tendencies do come up when tackling specific subjects. For example, the question of the validity of the law. And as one of the critics was saying that, positivism and natural law they cannot coexist. It has to be one or the other, and not necessarily both and yes, I actually agree with the critics that indeed Hart's conception of the law is incompatible with legal positivism. Because I am aware in a way that most of the legal positivists usually came out strongly out of the gates with a particular stand. But then we see Hart, when it comes to a certain topic, then in a way he agrees with natural law. When it comes to another topic, then he is purely a legal positivist. So for me, in a way, he comes off as someone who doesn't really have a standing, in my opinion.
Is he a realist?
Is he a realist? For me, would I say that he is a realist? I guess in a way, because he's accepting, because I believe a realist is someone who accepts a situation.
Mm-hmm. So he's practical.
Exactly, like he is practical. Because again, you cannot, I think Arike said the same thing, you cannot entirely be one thing, like you have to be a mixture. So now like Hart in this particular context, like in some topics or some discussions, you see his natural law tendencies coming out. In other topics, you see his positivist tendencies coming out. And that just goes to say that you can't entirely just be on one side. At one point, you might be forced to go to the other side. And in this case, that will be natural law. So I do agree with the critic that, yes, in a way, Hart is actually departing from the classical theorist conception of the law. And I will say I agree with Hart to some extent, because I don't think I've been put in a box to say that if you don't agree to natural law, then you will be short or anything. So for me, I do agree with natural law to an extent. I do agree with Hart to an extent. And then I also do agree with the critics that come about in relation to Hart's conception of the law to a certain extent. Now,
so what would be your jurisprudence, Chelsea, eventually, if I were to ask you?
Mm-hmm.
What is your jurisprudence?
I would say that I am a natural law. I am a natural law. It's not a theorist really, but I ascribe to natural law theory. Mm-hmm. But to an extent, I also ascribe to legal positivism.
So who are you?
I'm in the middle, basically. But if I do have to pick a side, then I think I would, like, if I was to be told pick legal positivism or natural law, I would actually go with natural law.
Okay. No one necessarily would tell you to pick which one, but you have to be able to know where would you want to belong, or where do you think, which theory feasibly explains what is law for you?
For me, I believe it's it should be okay between the two now, like positivism, natural law, utilitarian. I think for me it would be natural law, uh, because that's the one that makes sense to me. Because the moment you begin to live in a society where it's only, laws are commands and they have sanctions and it's all about sovereign, but we're not really agreeing with the fact that, human beings, like the nature of human beings, actually does have a relation with the laws and how they should be enforced and implemented, then I think in that way we'll basically just be lying to ourselves. So for me, I will say that I ascribe to natural law theory and to some extent legal positivism.
Okay, great, great. So you
Yes,
you may be a sister of heart. Okay,
maybe,
maybe,
probably. Yes, yes, yes.
maybe.
And yes, and just to answer your other question very briefly, one other question that I think I could attempt: can a judge refuse to apply a law that he considers to be immoral? I
Mm-hmm.
would say in this particular case, it depends,
Mm-hmm.
because once about judges, they should be like they shouldn't be biased when it comes to certain, things. And I'd just like to take us back to Musinga, the current Court of Appeal judge, president, I believe so, and his issue on LGBTQ. And you see, for him, his decision, we will say, was informed by his religious beliefs. So, in that particular context, he considered LGBTQ or same sex relations for that matter to be immoral, I would say purely based on what he believes religiously.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a way, I feel like that is limiting, because then now, if everyone refuses to apply laws just because they think it's immoral or it doesn't, ascribe to their religion, then in a way we are limiting jurisprudence, because I was really looking forward to seeing how he looks at it from a legal point of view. And that way we're able to have, two sides of the coin and really be able to understand what is Kenya's jurisprudence on the issue of same-sex relations, because naturally everyone will be against it. So I'm just looking forward to seeing him bring out maybe a different side, but then again, at the end of the day, he is entitled to his own opinion. So for me, I don't think it makes sense. Okay, not even on the same sex relation, but just generally for a judge to refuse to apply a law because he considers it to be immoral. But then in the case where he actually does consider that particular law to be immoral, then I think that particular judge will have to give us enough reasons for us to actually believe and probably agree with, what he has to say about that particular whatever it is and why it is immoral.
Can you,
That's
as a jurist, can you, as a judge,
mhm.
distinguish yourself? Can you
Right.
distinguish yourself for what you believe in? Like, can I say today I'm a judge? After, when I'm robed, I'm a judge. When I get out of the court, I am somebody else.
Yes, I believe there should be a balance. There should be a balance, because in court, when you go to court, you are basically representing like the institution. That's what I think.
Mm-hmm.
And your views on different topics can differ. And I think it's just similar to, I just use the Chitembwe decision, the one that has been considered to be one of the worst decisions. Maybe at that particular point, like he would, because he's in court and he's trying maybe to build on jurisprudence or to achieve justice, then he will say that because this girl was acting in a particular way, then this and this and this would be the judgment. But then I don't expect him, if maybe his daughter was found in a similar situation that is outside court, for him to have behaved the way he behaved inside court. So I feel like there should be a balance,
Okay.
because one is maybe purely work and then the other one is, your personal life.
Okay.
Just my
Great.
thought. Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. This, let's hear Ibrahim and then Masiarike, and then I want to share with you a few things.
Dr.
Just,
Ari, I'd like to start with the question that I'm a judge, and a case is presented to me, and it has an issue that I find it immoral. I think if I sit there and make a determination on that case, then I might not serve justice because already I'm biased. So um, probably, assumingly, I'm the one who is a judge there, and there's a question of that touches on morality, and I'm already biased. Then definitely, I will make a determination that conforms to my biasness, but justifies through legal gimmicks. I think so. So I think the best way could be I just recuse myself and say this one I cannot pronounce it myself because I'm already there's a biasness. Unless now I can see how I'll control the bias and ultimately come up with an objective determination. But I think if you sit there and already you are biased, then the justice will not be served. That's I believe. And many a times I find this happening because, like in Gitari, you find now judges are there. They have already we know their background. Again, they are making the determination on something that we know where they will be heading to. I think justice is not served there. The other one is about death penalty and the Muritat case. I read this a while back, so I may have forgotten one or two things. But I think the case was that when there is a law that ties the judge's hand in terms of now making their discretion, I think that becomes a problematic. So I think law should not restrict judges in terms of making or pronouncing the cases. They should be made. They should be allowed to use their own mind, apply their own mind, and use their judicial discretion in a way. So I think that's my idea. My thinking was that when it comes to Muriatetu, now saying that someone has killed them, put him to death. That is what they were saying. Probably that this is tying our hands in a way. So that's why they were saying.
Yeah, that's what they're saying. That the law was unconstitutional because it was tying the judge's hands.
Yeah. So I think, and then with respect to Elehad, I really like his argument, and I still believe if because of the society and all these things, if we make a law that conforms to the society's wishes, to me that is really objective. Even though now the seniors were saying this is objective, but I still believe Hart's one is really objective because this is the one that's reflecting the reality on the ground. So I personally am a proponent of Hart's conception of law.
Great. Yes, Masiarike, and I'm trying to get a few things here. Masiarike?
Okay.
I think maybe
So,
let me ask the last question, which people might confuse. When I said, can a judge refuse to adjudicate a case in accordance with the law because it would result in an immoral conclusion? Can a judge refuse to adjudicate a case in accordance with the law because it would result in an immoral conclusion according to him? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Mercy.
okay, so I'll start with the first point of discussion, and we are just looking at Hart's jurisprudence and what exactly does he ascribe to, and is he deviating from the classical point of view? I think yes, and I think that was the point to him to kind of deviate. But I also think it builds upon that people are saying I think rather than convoluting, he seems to just be building upon it. Um, on the second issue of the judges, if a judge can refuse to apply the law because of the moral consequence of the application, as Chelsea said, a person as a judge, who you are as a person, and who you are as a court ought to be two different things. Um, the court itself has its own guidance, it has its own morality, and it has its own rules, which are separate from your rules as a person. When you are seated in court, when you're seated in that room as a court of law, you have guidance in the law itself and in the way you apply it. So, unless the judge in Kenya specifically, unless the judge is saying this law is unconstitutional and so it ought not to be applied, then the judge is bound to apply the law as is. So the only way, I think we had even talked about this previously, where the whole idea of positivism is that it's contained, it's a system that is contained within its own system, so that if you think the system has a flaw within the system, there's a way to change it. So if the judge thinks it's going to be of a bad moral consequence, then within the system there's a way to change that. But if he cannot change it as the system says, the legal system, then the court, the binding nature of the court obligates the judge to apply the law as it is. That's his obligation. You're guided by this law, you're obligated to apply it. So if it will end up with a consequence that to you seems immoral, then then if the court does not think it's immoral, then that's just your business, unfortunately.
Okay, so like the judge should decide the case regardless, even if he believes the consequence is immoral. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying.
Okay. And to that end, I want to bring in the sexual offenses between adolescents. Okay. I believe Section 8 of the Sexual Offences Act, which says that you have carnal knowledge, wherever. If there's penetration with a minor, then that's defilement. And the question, which I think we have discussed in this class earlier, the question, what about if the penetration was done by a person under the age of 18 too? Would that constitute defilement? And so that's the basis. How much time do you have? Okay, I remember in 2008, I had been contracted to do a study in what we call the social context. How if it's possible for judges, for magistrates. Okay, so we started it at the magistrate level. If it was possible for magistrates to decide cases in accordance with the social context of the case, and not necessarily the law. So I actually did the study around courts at the court. Courts at the coast. Okay. So remember, I did interviews here with magistrates in Mombasa. I went to Malindi. I went to Voi, just to hear: is it possible for judges or for magistrates to decide a case according to its social context, according to the realities of that case, according to the particulars of the case? I think that's the according to the particulars of the case, and not necessarily according to the law. See, like what Dr. Dechi has written. Her PhD was not necessarily social context, but what she was arguing is that if we have we'll call it what? Sex with minors, sex with minors among close relatives, it's not very foreign in Kenya that a father sleeps with the daughter, an uncle sleeps with the daughter, a brother sleeps with the sister, uncle with the niece. Like, there's a lot more than you happening. And of course, if you look at the Sexual Offences Act, that's against the law. And so the perpetrator should go to jail. And Marcy's argument was, what if we resort to restorative justice? Restorative justice. I think it's at the university repository. You can look at it. At least read the introduction. Restorative justice. What if we say, instead of sending this person to jail, what if we see whether we can get justice, but this person not going to court? Because if he goes to court, the perpetrator, who is the father of that child, who fends for the child? So we leave this girl who's been impregnated again now to look to fend for the child. What about the child? Is she or he divorced from parental love? Such things, some very, very dirty things to think about. But anyway, this is law, this is jurisprudence. And yeah, so So I'm trying to think in that context. So this was 2008. Perhaps it read into some of these uh, principles of justice later. But whether should we strictly send people to jail, follow the law and send people to jail just because the law says that that's how it is? Or can we invoke, can we imbue the social context, the particularities of the case and see another way of reaching justice? So that was my study. And it was funded. I think my client was the World Bank, and they wanted me to find out how that. So one magistrate in Mombasa rather told me, no, we follow the law. Our hands are tied. Even when I feel that this conclusion is wrong, but if that's the law, then that's the law. That's how I would do it. I made so this is a man. I don't know whether gender had a part to play. Then I got to Voi and I met a lady magistrate and I asked her. She brings no. This, in fact, this Sexual Offences Act is so bad. It needs to be amended. How do I send a boy of the relatively same age as the girl? How do I send him to jail just because he had sex with this girl? Both are children. So who defiled the other? That's the question. I still remember how it was today. Who defiled the other? Because they're both of the same, relatively same age. So I wonder whether, and there's a present debate at the moment. There's a present debate at the moment. There's a call for the amendment of the Sexual Offences Act. So there's a call of the amendment of sexual offences on many angles, different angles. Remember the Court of Appeal case we saw, and I think it's in your course outline under the natural law discussion, where it also calls for the amendment of Sexual Offences Act and says, of course, that calls for the reduction of the minimum age of consent. But there are calls from courts, especially from child rights advocates, that the Sexual Offences Act needs to be amended because when the sex is between adolescents of almost the same age, then we cannot say one defiled the other. Like let's say all these both of them are children in need of protection and they should go for counseling. So and of course there are many cases. Maybe I can okay, what do I do? Okay, I could possibly post them, about 2 or 3 cases where the courts have said because these are children of almost the same age, then we cannot say there was defilement. Okay, when they say defilement only occurs when one of the children is of a relatively higher age, like a 17-year-old with a 12-year-old. But where they change, I think internationally they're agreeing that where the age difference is between 3 to 4 years, 2 to 3 years, then there's no defilement. I don't know where they get that criteria from, but they say, oh, these are almost of the same ages, so then it's not defilement. But where there is a gap like 4 years and above, then that's defilement. Okay, so I can share with that, but I think what I was trying to check before I came in was what the DPP has created some rules, and maybe you can check them. I think read them by yourself, or maybe I should also post them. Just a minute. Okay, I will post them. Diversion rules. Okay, it's not the law. The sexual offense that hasn't been changed, but we have now diversion rules where the office of the DPP is now saying when can the prosecutor, when the prosecutor has been presented with a case of sex between children of the same ages, of almost similar ages, when do you decide as a prosecutor to take the case to court? And when do you decide this is not a case to go to court? Perhaps maybe as the law is defying the law, the Sexual Offences Act, because the Sexual Offences Act says when somebody has had uh, uh, sex with a person under the age 18, it's a sexual offense. So okay, so that is something we want to do. I want to show you another case. This is a very, very interesting case. Okay, this is okay, let me show you from, I brought it out in my thesis, my PhD thesis. Okay, let me share with you. It's a very, very interesting argument. You can get the citation and see it. Oh, I'm supposed to present. Okay, so this is a part of my thesis that was, anyway, it's the version that I could easily get. It may not have a lot. It was corrupted by the machine, but anyway, I think you can. Okay. Okay, so this is an argument. So it's corrupted by machine. The machine lost my spacing. So you might see some words that are not very well spaced. But this is what I was arguing. What the judge, my argument was that some judges, so my thesis is about Muslim women's inheritance rights. That's what it is about. But at this particular point, I was arguing that some judges are uncomfortable applying Islamic inheritance law. They are uncomfortable applying Islamic inheritance law. Yet, if you look at the Law of Succession Act, Section 2, subsection 3, it allows for the application of Islamic inheritance law both at the Qadhi's courts and in the mainstream courts. Okay, so this is what I was trying to say, that Justice Sunday. So this is the re-estate of CCBH. You can get it. Just if you go to Kenya Law, go there and get it. You get the full citation and maybe you'll get the right place. So in the re-estate of CCBH, of course, this is the deceased person. So his name has been abbreviated to protect him, to protect the family. I say Justice Sunday was at pains to confirm the applicants as ineligible to inherit their deceased father's estate because of their illegitimacy. This is what Justice Sunday said. Indeed, referring to any child as illegitimate in this day and age appears to be outrageous. However, as long as this estate herein belongs to a deceased Muslim, and as long as Article 24(4) remains in our Constitution, and further, as long as Section 2(3) remains in the Law of Succession Act, the court's hands are tied. In any other circumstances, the court would not require elaborate persuasion to find in favor of the applicants. So what had happened here briefly is that the father, now the deceased, was Muslim. He cohabits with a woman who is non-Muslim. and they give birth to two children. So they give birth to two children, and okay, so that what happens. This guy dies then, and the question was whether the two children that he sad with this woman can inherit him. Of course, the family of the man was saying no. The man had no property of his own. Before he died, is that his father died. So he was supposed to inherit his father's estate. Before he could inherit the father's estate, he also dies. And therefore, his mother goes to the Qadhi's court and says, well, the children of my son cannot inherit because they're illegitimate. Okay? And so the Qadhi's court agrees with the mother of the deceased. The woman who was cohabiting with the deceased invokes that he does not agree with the Qadhi's court as a forum. So she invokes Article 170 of Article 5, and therefore moves to the High Court, which is here now. Justice Sunday is deciding, and now Justice Sunday is saying. So this is why Justice Sunday is reaching this argument. So of course, Justice Sunday agrees with the court, with the Qadhi's court, and says, "Oh, they cannot inherit because they're illegitimate children." But she nonetheless expresses her opinion. So to her, the children should have inherited. But she says, as long as the estate herein belongs to a deceased Muslim, and as long as Article 24(4) remains in our Constitution, and as long as Section 2(3) remains in the Law Succession Act, the court's hands are tied. In any other circumstances, the court would not require elaborate persuasion to find in favor of the applicants. Okay, so not that she agrees with what the court is saying, but she feels forced to apply the law the way it is. I think it gets very interesting in this case when Justice Sunday decides the way she decides, the woman appeals the Court of Appeal. So at the Court of Appeal, it's called what? Christine Kimwana, I think. Just you can search for it. Christine Kimwana. This is the woman, Christine Kimwana Chuba. Oh, she appeals against Justice Sunday's decision. And of course, this is where I was saying, this is the case that I thought the court had an end, and it maneuvered the law until it got to the end. It's so sad. I've just seen, because I remember I was telling the advocate who was doing this case, the moment it came out, I was like, no, that's against the law. They have read the law wrong. And I really wanted us to go to appeal at the Supreme Court. And I was like, and join me in the case. I can argue the case at the Supreme Court. We have different interpretations of the law. I think my senior was thinking that he needed, if you look at Article 163, Subarticle 2, that the appeals to the Supreme Court must be first only on general important, must be certified as one of general public importance, or it must be one relating to human rights. So my senior, the one who was prosecuting this case, believed that this case belonged to the cohort that it must be certified as one of general public, which was wrong. This is a case that related to the definition of human rights, to the interpretation of human rights, and I thought it was an automatic appeal to the Supreme Court. Of course, it's applied to the Supreme Court, and I don't know what the Supreme Court has said. I have just seen a decision released this year, which actually now went on to follow the wrong interpretation of the Court of Appeal in my opinion, and I think that's water under the bridge now. Okay, so yeah, Marcia, Ricky, I can see your hand is up, but then Wanjiri Chelsea, and then we can conclude. But I would really argue to look at the Court of Appeal case, the Christian Kimwana case. I don't think it's not a very long decision, but it's and see how the court meandered to get. I think it's important just to see how it is, and I think we will also revisit it when we're doing a legal realism. We'll revisit that case. Okay, Marcia Rike.
So for me, I think this would be one of the biggest cons for having judges. If you think the consequence of the law would be immoral, then you can deviate. The question becomes, what exactly is our standard? Because, as we say, judges are just people, and people have different ideas of what is moral and what is not, depending on what informs how they think. So
Mm-hmm.
that the very idea of having the law and having a standard to guide them is we have some sort of predictability. I know if you apply the law in this way, then you ought to get to this decision. And if we are talking about this Christine Kimwana case, in the idea of the advocate and the people who are reading the law, and even in the lower courts, both the high court and the Cadiz court, the law was applied as it's written, and regardless of what the judge thought in the succession case in the high court, this is where I'm going to reach. So there's a predictability to it. But then when you come to the judge saying, but the outcome is immoral, so I ought to apply it differently, then we have some sort of, where do we draw the line? Whose morality are we going to go with, so that even if this judge says it's immoral, then we have some sort of like qualification of which morality we are going to apply. So I think if the system has a way of changing, so that if judges think that the end is immoral, then they ought to tell parliament, let's have this written. There's nothing stopping the law from saying, when it comes to children and inheritance, then the law that shall apply is the law of the land and not personal law. Then everybody knows where we stand, and everybody knows, like, there's again predictability, so that we don't apply some abstract moral qualification to questions of the law.
Okay, why you Chelsea?
Maybe to comment on the same thing, or can a judge refuse to decide a case or to follow a law because it is immoral? When you mentioned Mombasa magistrate, I remembered another. I'm not sure if this was over. I think this year, where there was a woman and the husband charged because of stealing a packet of flour, and generally stealing they were charged because of it, but the judge pardoned them, and because he was moved, maybe out of compassion, because they had stolen, because the children had slept hungry. Now the judge in this case, had they really followed the law? And can we say in a case like this, they are allowed to not
To
follow the
decide.
law? And also, on you had mentioned about the sexual offenses. With the adolescents, I think I'm in agreement, but with the one where it's a relative abusing a child who is also a relative, and instead of sentencing this relative, we think of other alternative modes of justice. I'd still be for sentencing the relative, because, or if it's a parent or something, because aside from catering financially for this child, there's protection that the child needs. The rights are not just to be provided for financially, and this parent at this point will not be able to do that for the child.
Okay. Uh, thank you, Chelsea. And maybe you could share with us that the case of the judge. I think I heard about it. That's a very, very good case to bring in on board in a jurisprudence class. That so the law says if you steal, there are some penalties to it, but the judge feels that Now, the social context of the case is she's told because of what? Because the children were hungry. So, again, is it moral to send them to jail? And would that solve? So, of course, we're saying offenses are done against the state. So, would the state, society, would the society being compensated by sending this couple to jail? What happens to the children? Are they not part of the society? So this is it's a very good case, and I would encourage you to share it with the rest of the class. You can also send it to me on email. I think it's a very
I
good
saw
one.
it on the news. I'm not sure if it's
Oh,
actually
it
there
is,
in
I think
the
actually
reports
it is.
because it was a magistrate. Yeah.
Oh, so you don't think it's reported, right? Yeah, yeah. But anyway, there was a case. There was a case in that regard. I also remember it. Yes, Ibrahim, conclude for us.
Yes, Dr. I just wanted to get your views. This issue of illegitimate children not inheriting from the estate of their fathers or their relatives. It is an Islamic doctrine, and probably this is something that was passed from maybe 1,400 years ago. There is a lot of changes from then up to now. Is there a change in Islamic philosophy, or still that is the rule? Though in thought it's very clear this is the rule, I know, but is there a change in the Islamic philosophy or towards these kind of issues?
Yeah, is there a change of philosophy? Maybe yes. Is there a change of the law? No. I remember when I was doing my field study, I met one of the cadres and I was like, what do we do? And he says, what if the father acknowledges paternity? Like, yes, I got them outside the wedlock, but they're mine. Should those children be able to inherit? That's the question that we haven't been able to respond to. But yeah, that's what it is. Yeah, and you can see what Justice Sanders saying in this day and age. Can we still term some children illegitimate? And I think we are saying, is the societal attitude changing? Is it our morals changing? Because I think before it might have been agreeable in many parts of the world that such children should not inherit. But now there's a change that a child is a child, absent of the activity that brought him or her to the world. Yeah. So that's the could be change of of of, uh, of minds as to the law. But I think the law as it is remains as it is. That these children do not inherit, but they do not inherit from their father only. The way I know Islamic law, they inherit from their mother. It's very interesting, which brings in the case of Sylvanus or Lusashi, which I forgot to discuss, but I hope which you have enjoyed reading. Where Justice Kiage says, children are always the babies of their mothers, perhaps the maybes of their fathers. So, and I remember when I was commenting this, and I said, yeah, this resembles the Islamic principle, because Islam says, so this child will be born out of wedlock would inherit the mother, because it's observable that the mother is the one that was carrying the pregnancy. As to who was the father, but the father, because the father did not uh, marry her or planted seeds in a farm that did not belong to him, then that product is not his. You can understand the Islamic principle that the seeds were planted in a farm that never belonged to the father. So the product will not be his. But it is certain that the product is the mother's. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I don't know whether I've answered your question, but I may have meandered as well, like the Court of Appeal judges. Yeah, but very, very interesting. I hope you enjoyed reading the Sylvanus Wolusachi case. I posted it in the classroom. There were questions that you needed to agree. And I think and we can bring this next week when we're looking at the heart and fuller discussion on morality. what both Justice Mumbi Ngugi and Kiagi were saying relating to the connection between law and morality. Sawa. Guys, I beg to go now. I think we have done much. At least I've managed to see you through the class. So we will next week will be very interesting in terms of time. But I'll see. I think the reason I developed a headache is because I went to I went to a funeral actually. I lost my grandmother the day last now will be when? Today is Thursday evening, yeah. So yesterday I went there and I think I maybe I wasn't in a very good state of mind, but I went nonetheless. So yeah, the Bible will be next week, which might invoke some questions for some people, but that's none of your business. So I'll be there on Thursday. I'm not sure whether I'll be there on Saturday, but we'll see, and I will see how I can navigate that because we can't afford to lose a class. But yeah, so see you on Thursday. If there's any other communication I would make, but we'll meet on Thursday. I will see how Saturday fares up. I will communicate. Thank you so much. See you.
We are very sorry about the loss, Doc.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.